Lady Rosamond Innis, wife of the late Sir Probyn Innis, joining us virtually. Angela Innis and Marcia Innis, daughters of the late Sir Probyn Innis. Gail Gray Phillip, head of the University of the West Indies Open Campus, St. Kitts and Nevis. Isabel Byron, the University of the West Indies Open Campus Site Coordinator for Nevis. Percival Hanley, General Manager, Brimstone Hill Fortress National Park, and other members of staff. Members of the History and Heritage Month Committee. Professor Jessica Byron Reed, guest speaker for this evening's event. Sanjay Keynes, Chapter Chair, Student Guild, St. Kitts and Nevis Chapter. Roxanne Herbert, Vice Chapter Chair, Student Guild, St. Kitts and Nevis Chapter. Special guests, UWI students, media practitioners, staff of the Corporate Relations Department of the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 2023 Sir Probyn Innis Memorial Lecture. This hybrid version of the lecture is being transmitted from the Bernice White Lecture Room at the ECCB headquarters in St. Kitts and Nevis. This year's topic is Celebrating 400 Years of Ancestral Creativity and Ingenuity. The distinguished presenter is Professor Jessica Byron Reed, former Director, Institute of International Relations, St. Augustine Campus, Trinidad and Tobago, and former lecturer, Department of Government, Mona Campus, Jamaica. The University of the West Indies has been collaborating with the History and Heritage Month Committee since 2018 to host the Sir Probyn Innis Memorial Lecture. This lecture recognizes the sterling contribution of Sir Probyn has made to the preservation and documentation of the history and culture of the Federation of St. Christopher and Nevis. Sir Probyn served his country with distinction in various capacities, and at the highest level, Governor of the Associated State of St. Kitts, Nevis, Anguilla, and then as Governor of St. Kitts and Nevis from 1975 to 1981. He also served as the President of the Brimstone Hill National Park Society and initiated the History and Heritage Week, now called the History and Heritage Month. This evening's lecture is in his honor. The lecture is being streamed via the UWI campus and the UWI Open Campus St. Kitts Nevis site Facebook pages and the UWI Open Campus and ECCB Connect's YouTube channels. This presentation, we promise, will be informative, enlightening, and thought-provoking. So I invite you to invite your relatives, friends, and colleagues to join us using any of the social media platforms mentioned. You, our virtual audience, will have the opportunity to share your views and pose questions during the question and answer segment. I now invite Gail Gray Phillip, head of the University of the West Indies Open Campus, St. Kitts and Nevis site, to bring you welcome remarks.
Good evening and welcome to the 6th annual Sir Probyn Innis Memorial Lecture. Many years ago, as Shermalon indicated, Sir Probyn Innis initiated the History and Heritage Month of activities. And as she said, Sir Probyn was the Governor General of St. Kitts and Nevis from 1975 to 1981. And he served for many years as the President of the Management Council of the Brimstone Hill Fortress and National Park Society. As usual, this year, the lecture is organized by the University of the West Indies Open Campus for St. Kitts and Nevis, and in collaboration with the History and Heritage Month Committee. And we are supported by our team here with the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank. I'm delighted to welcome Lady Innis, who is joining us online. And as Sharmalon indicated, a special welcome to Angela and Marcia. They are here with us, present here at Eastern Caribbean Central Bank. A warm welcome to Mr. Percival Hanley, President of the History and Heritage Month Committee. Special welcome also to Ms. Isabel Byron, who is a site coordinator for Nevis, and other members of staff of the Open Campus for St. Kitts and Nevis. This year, the theme for History and Heritage Month is celebrating 400 years of ancestral creativity and ingenuity. I'm honored to welcome Professor Jessica Byron Reid, our distinguished speaker. Professor Byron Reid is from Nevis, so she's no stranger to us here. She worked for many years with the University of the West Indies in various capacities. She served as a lecturer, head of Department of Government at the Mona campus in Jamaica, director of the Institute of International Relations at the St. Augustine campus in Trinidad. Before that, she was a foreign affairs officer here with the government of St. Kitts and Nevis, and then with the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, where she was based at the East Caribbean High Commission in London. She has published extensively on Caribbean, Latin American international relations, and on small islands, small states and territories in the global political economy. I also express special welcome to special invited guests who are family, including family members of Professor Byron Reid. Now, as you know, this year, the University of the West Indies celebrates 75 years, and we're celebrating under the theme, Rooted, Ready, Rising. Earlier this week, Mr. Sanjay Keynes, the recently elected Open Campus Student Guild Chapter Chair for St. Kitts and Nevis, wrote a poem to commemorate this milestone. So Mr. Keynes is present today, and he will present his poem for the first time this evening, so we're looking forward to that. We also welcome the Vice Chapter Chair, Ms. Roxana Herbert, and other Open Campus students who are here at the ECCB. A very special welcome to those who are joining us online, the various Facebook pages, Open Campus St. Kitts and Nevis Facebook page, Open Campus Caribbean Facebook page, Open Campus YouTube, and ECCB Connects. The lecture is not limited to persons in St. Kitts and Nevis. With the aid of technology, we have persons join us from our neighboring Caribbean islands and beyond, viewing on the various platforms. So I look forward to seeing the online questions and the comments, especially during the question and answer segment. We look forward to a very informative, thought-provoking, and interactive lecture. I welcome you all. Have a good evening.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Gray Phillip. As Mrs. Phillip mentioned, this lecture is part of the activities for the 2023 History and Heritage Month, which is being spearheaded by the Brimstone Hill National Park Society. I now invite the General Manager of the Brimstone Hill Fortress National Park, Mr. Percival Hanley, to bring you greetings.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Please allow me to adopt the protocols previously established. Ladies and gentlemen, those present and those who have joined us online, good evening and welcome to this 2023 edition of the History and Heritage Sir Probyn Innis Memorial Lecture. Unfortunately, our president, Mr. D. Michael Morton, was unable to attend due to another commitment, and therefore he sends his regrets. This event is one of several for History and Heritage Month 2023. The month of activities is an annual social outreach activity organized by the Brimstone Hill Fortress National Park Society, the Nevis Historical and Conservation Society, the St. Christopher National Trust, the Department of Culture, Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Youth Empowerment, Aging and Disabilities, the University of the West Indies Open Campus, and other interested individuals who form the History and Heritage Committee. We present annually a variety of activities throughout the month of February, sometimes spilling over into March, as has been in this case, which seek to promote greater knowledge, understanding, and appreciation of the history, heritage, and culture of our country among our citizens, thereby fostering stronger national identity and pride. The History and Heritage activities, which started originally as a week of activities, as mentioned earlier, some 18 years ago, and later expanded to a month of activities, was the brainchild of the late Sir Probyn Innis, president of the Brimstone Hill Fortress National Park Society from 2005 to 2017. He was not only the founder, he was passionate about it. And he spent a lot of his time and energy putting the activities together each year. Therefore, after his passing, the Council of Management of the Brimstone Hill Fortress National Park Society deemed it necessary to memorialize the sterling contribution of Sir Probyn to the Brimstone Hill Fortress National Park Society. Council therefore agreed on a proposal to rename the History and Heritage Lecture the Sir Probyn Innis Memorial Lecture. Many of us can recall the several lectures and presentations on history and heritage that were presented by Sir Probyn himself, and many of us are familiar with his books and writings of that kind. Sir Probyn's wife, Lady Rosamond Innis, was unable to be here at the lecture in person tonight, but she has joined us online, and her daughters Angela and Marcia are here with us tonight, so we wish to extend a special welcome to them and to say a special good night and good evening to Lady Innis as she watches online. The Brimstone Hill Fortress National Park Society and the History and Heritage Committee are delighted to have Professor Jessica Byron Reid with us this evening as the guest speaker in the annual Sir Probyn Innis Memorial Lecture. Professor Byron Reid is a bona fide daughter of the soil, hailing from Nevis, and we will hear more about her shortly. Thank you, Professor, for agreeing to speak to us tonight, and we look forward with great anticipation to your presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Thank you for logging on. And do sit back and relax and enjoy tonight's lecture presentation, and do participate in the discussion which will follow, which I expect will be a lively one. Thank you and good evening.
Thank you, Mr. Hanley. We just heard that we have an aspiring, budding poet in our midst. So I now invite Sanjay Keynes. He's also the newly elected chapter chair of the Student Guild of the St. Kitts and Nevis chapter, to render his poem written to commemorate the UE's 75th anniversary.
Pleasant good evening to all. Rooted in the region, the UWI stands privileged and tall, supported by 75 years of history and commitment to us all. In the Caribbean, our roots spread both deep and wide, nourishing our mission to advance our Caribbean pride, advocating for the region's needs and sustained growth, using vehicles of realness and honesty to increase worth, ready as a place of light, liberty, and continuous learning, creating opportunities for both empowerment and earning, with expertise to overcome the many challenges that we face, creating resilience and leadership that can impact our global space. Ready to assist you in your journey on the road to success, navigating the potholes and crossroads as you progress. Rising to the calls for sustainable development, we aspire to give hope to both individuals and communities to inspire. Celebrating this milestone of service in our academic leadership role, overcoming each challenge with a mission to reach every goal, increasing prolifically while soaring, we recommit to all. Now, the opportunity presents to rise together, answer the call.
Thank you, Sanjay. Well written. And of course, you remember this is where you had your debut when you become a famous poet. Celebrating 400 years of ancestral creativity and ingenuity. What characterized the defining periods? How did our ancestors navigate those periods? What lessons have our ancestors left us? Are we prepared to build on their creativity and ingenuity? Ladies and gentlemen, Therese Charles, one of the students of the UWI Open Campus St. Kitts and Nevis, will introduce our distinguished speaker.
Good evening. Professor Jessica Byron Reid was director of the University of the West Indies Institute of International Relations at the UWI St. Augustine campus in Trinidad and Tobago from August 2016 until August 2022. She is also a member of the Caribbean Policy Consortium, a group of professionals that engages in research and policy advocacy on U.S.-Caribbean relations. She lectured at the Mona campus of the UWI 1994 to 2016. Professor Byron Reid was the first female head of the Department of Government on the Mona campus 2010 to 2013, and also the first female director of the Institute of International Relations at St. Augustine. She coordinated graduate studies for the Department of Government for a decade, and between 2006 and 2014, she was UWI coordinator of a tripartite BSc, MSc program in politics and international cooperation jointly delivered by the University of Bordeaux Sciences Po, the Université Antilles in Martinique, and the UWI Mona. She was professor fellow at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies, Mona 2015 to 2016. She has served as visiting professor at the Université Antilles in Guadeloupe and at the Universidad Nacional de Colombia in San Andrés, and she also lectured between 1990 and 1997 at the International Institute of Social Studies, Erasmus University, the Netherlands. Before her academic career, Dr. Byron Reid was a Foreign Service Officer with the government of St. Kitts and Nevis, and then with the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, based at the East Caribbean High Commission in London. Professor Byron Reid has worked with a number of international research consortia and multilateral agencies on regional and global political, economic, and social issues. She is currently a member of the Alumni Advisory Committee of the Graduate Institute of Geneva, an associate of the Resilient and Sustainable Islands Initiative, coordinated by the UK Overseas Department Institute, and she has served for 4 years as Caribbean member on the Committee of International Affairs of the World Council of Churches. Professor Byron Reed has published extensively on Caribbean Latin America international relations and on small states and territories in the global political economy.
You want me here now? Okay, thanks. Can you hear me? Good evening, everyone. I'm going to beg your permission to follow all protocols that have been established, but I would like to address Lady Rosamond Innis and Angela and Marcia in particular, and of course, Mr. Hanley, who is my very good friend and former classmate in sixth form, and it's a delight to see him again, and Mrs. Phillips, and ladies and gentlemen, friends, both gathered in the room, and those who are following the lecture on Facebook and YouTube. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to a few words that I have to say. I hope that I don't bore you too much. So let me start the formal lecture now. Celebrating 400 years of ancestral creativity and ingenuity. So thank you very much to the Open Campus and to the Heritage and History and Heritage Month Committee and the Historical Society for this invitation. I am very appreciative of Sir Probyn's personal contribution to researching and writing some of the history of St. Kitts and Nevis and preserving the memories and broadening our individual and collective knowledge about our country and its development through the centuries. I have learned a lot about the history of Bastille from his monograph, Historic Bastille, and I hope that it continues to be consulted along with the many other local and regional historical publications, including a growing number of biographies and autobiographies and oral history that have become available in recent years to teach history and social studies and geography and environmental studies in our schools. And I hope that all these sources are used by a majority of our people. Thanks also to the East Caribbean Central Bank for so graciously providing this venue. I recall the former ECCB Governor, Sir Dwight Venner, who was also chair of the Open Campus Council. One of his visions was that the Open Campus and regional institutions like the East Caribbean Central Bank would shine an intellectual light in the non-campus territories by facilitating open lectures, discussions, debates, exhibitions, and other activities that would stimulate knowledge dissemination, critical thinking, and vibrant debate on key issues and themes in our territories. And in this regard, the East Caribbean Central Bank has played an admirable role. Now, just a word on Caribbean histories. Now, every locale in this world has many histories. The events featured and their interpretation will vary widely depending on the narrator. History and historiography are deeply political and politicized subjects. And the best-known versions of events usually reflect the perspectives of the most powerful. My own discipline, international relations, is being deeply challenged by post-colonial and non-Western thinkers because its traditional accounts are silent about imperialism, colonialism, and how they changed the current world order. Now, Caribbean history is a part of that story. In our region, European colonizations brought over 5 centuries of violence, invasion, dispossession, and colonial appropriations of the region's lands and seas, which destroyed the pre-Columbian societies that were here, almost totally annihilating their people. And the establishment of plantation societies that followed was based on the kidnapping, enslavement, and prolonged oppression of our African ancestors, and the exploitation of indentured labor from India, China, Madeira, and other places. All this eventually led to the slow emergence of post-colonial and multicultural societies based on all the fragments of the past. Now we are still in the process of discovering and rewriting and expanding our histories. Earlier versions and many of the official records mostly recount events from the perspective of colonial governments and the planter class in Caribbean plantation societies. But the last 50 years of historical research and production are by far the most exciting. Why? Because they have begun to feature the other voices, those who were most numerous but least heard, who made up the backbone of Caribbean societies and whose stories are just now coming to the fore. Technological evolution has democratized research and possibilities for publication. And so there's a wealth of new perspectives and new knowledge in our historical narratives. And in preparing this talk, I tried to access some of the voices and some of this new work, both from St. Kitts and Nevis and from elsewhere in the Caribbean. But it's not always the easiest to find. I am not a historian by training. My own areas are intrinsically interdisciplinary, and they draw on history. I've also always been interested in history, recognizing its centrality for understanding our past and present and orienting our futures. Unfortunately, despite the growth of historical debates and all the new knowledge available, history is now less significant in our education system than it used to be. Few young people do history past their 3rd year in secondary school. Even fewer pursue it as a major or even a minor at university. It may be felt that such subjects cannot get one a well-paid job and that other areas have much more to offer in a changing world and economy. Our country is undergoing rapid social and economic change. Many historical landscapes and artifacts and practices are disappearing. But I also have the impression that more recent publications on local history and the many attempts that are now taking place to revise histories to include the voices of underrepresented groups, such as Caribbean women, are not sufficiently known about or consulted. And this is very disturbing and disappointing. History is a foundation in our knowledge systems, and we have a lot of work to do to make it more central in the curriculum and to present it in more imaginative and engaging ways so that our people become engaged with our history in spite of themselves. We really need history in the Caribbean, in an understanding of history, not only to come to terms with our past and the various parts of our identity, but also to effectively address today's environmental, social, political, and economic development challenges. So I needed to get that off my chest because it's something I feel strongly about. And so now I will really talk about what you asked me to speak about this evening. So the topic for this evening talks about 400 years. That's a long time. So I've tried to be selective, and I'm going to structure the rest of the presentation as follows. We're going to look at the period of African enslavement, which generally dates from the early 1600s to various dates in the 1800s. And that period witnessed the establishment and entrenchment of plantation societies and economies. So I'll highlight the elements of this period which I think are critical to this theme, and then I'm going to dwell in greater detail on the following period of post-emancipation societies. And in phase 2, I'll explore how our ancestors further developed their survival strategies and skills, constructing viable peasant-based communities after 1838. One crucial phase was the period from the 1840s to the end of that century. And the other is the 20th century, during which our societies evolved from crown colonies to eventual independent statehood. At times, I will refer to the collective experiences of Caribbean people, and at other times, I will focus more narrowly on the Leeward Islands and on St. Kitts and Nevis. And then, of course, we will have a conclusion. So, basic premise. The basic premise of my talk is, first of all, that it is absolutely phenomenal that violently uprooted and traumatized people, many of them children, who had been snatched from their homes, family support, and material possessions, and who came from many different places, cultures, and societies in Africa, spoke different languages, and may have had different belief systems, not only survived, but collectively succeeded in reconstructing their lives, their dignity, their sense of self, despite so many hostile forces militating against them. The plantation system sought to strip them of their humanity, treat them as property, deprive them of all the basic human rights that we know of today. But despite this, and the suffering that was endured for over 400 years, our ancestors stubbornly survived. They painfully rebuilt communities, and they reestablished functional societies. After 1838, they were extremely resourceful and creative in finding ways and means to transform their lives from human bondage to as much autonomy as possible. And by the 21st century, as you are well aware, our societies have attained middle or high income levels of human development. Therein lies the greatest achievement of our ancestors. They reinvented themselves, rebuilt kinship networks and communities out of disruption, loss, fragmentation, and trauma. And they showed extreme courage and powers of endurance. And they kept faith in themselves and their gods. This was a triumph of the human spirit. So, beyond recognizing their exceptional personal qualities, now, how do I change this slide? What motivated our ancestors, and where can we identify? Yeah, it's changed. Thanks. Thank you. Where can we identify creativity and ingenuity in their activities? And this leads me to my second premise. To answer this question, I use Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs theory to better understand their struggles and their motivation. Now, Maslow proposes to us that the most fundamental human needs are the physiological ones: food, water, fresh air, shelter, rest, clothing, and reproduction. At the second level, there are safety and security needs, economic well-being, health, and physical security. At the third level are the psychological and social needs that are attached to belonging somewhere. That comes from family and friends and community networks, organizational membership, getting affection. And the fourth and fifth levels concern self-actualization and self-fulfillment needs, which motivate individuals' efforts to achieve and gain the respect and the appreciation of others. So our ancestors, understandably, first prioritized the strategies and the activities that would be fundamental for their material and economic survival. The need to survive made them open to experimentation. They were driven to discover new things in an unfamiliar environment, as well as drawing on the knowledge and the skills that they came with. They were driven to, well, they had to produce much of what they required for the most basic physiological needs. Both during and after slavery, in order to satisfy safety and security needs, as well as psychological and social needs, our ancestors had to draw deeply on their social resources and their adaptability, their flexibility. They developed a number of innovations in their social relations and practices so that they could cope with their new environments and circumstances. And they observed very closely the power structures and the dynamics of social relations around them, the behavior of the various actors, most of whom were more powerful than they were, and they sought to use these observations to maximum advantage. You might be wondering what this drawing represents. This, we are now speaking about the period of enslavement. Now, I would highly recommend to all of you, when you can, visit the Memorial Act Museum in Guadeloupe. It is a UNESCO-referenced museum on international slavery through the ages. It's a wonderful museum in which you could easily spend several days. But this is the Tree of Forgetting by an artist from Cameroon. And it's displayed near the section on the transatlantic slave trade in that museum. Displayed on the tree are the cultural possessions, rituals, and memories that captured people left behind as they entered the slave ships. Their names, their families, their clothes, their musical instruments, their belief systems, their plants, their food, and various articles of daily life like calabashes and so on. It is a stark image of loss. But equally powerful and persistent is the act of recall, of memory, where we retrieve bits and pieces of life through songs, dreams, stories, proverbs, and other means. Our ancestors were stripped of, but then they managed to recall those intangible memories and pieces of knowledge and customary practices, and they managed to reconstruct their lives in new, unknown environments with new influences, and ultimately blend the legacies of the past with the struggles and the multicultural influences of their present. So, during the slavery period, let's see what this is. Yeah, next one. Let us just recall specific conditions of slavery in the Leeward Islands, and more specifically in St. Kitts and Nevis. Now, St. Kitts and Nevis were first British settlements. They were colonized in 1624 and 1628. The African population was present in small numbers as early as the 1650s, but by 1770s, the ratio of enslaved Africans to the European population was about 10 to 1. About 350,000 enslaved Africans came to the Leeward Islands up until 1810, but their mortality rate was high because of the terrible living conditions. Historians and geographers argue that the plantation system operated differently in the Leeward Islands from how it operated in larger territories like Jamaica or the Southern Caribbean. The Leewards were much smaller, they had less natural resources, and intensive sugar cultivation had a harsh, very harsh ecological impact. And the small land areas enabled the planters to exercise stronger controls over the slave population. It was not possible to escape into the mountains or forests and establish free maroon communities, as was done in Jamaica and Suriname, and even in St. Vincent with the Black Caribs. Access to the sea and to boats was controlled by the planters, as these would have been the main means of escape, although to escape to where? That would have been the challenge. Even after emancipation in the British colonies, sea journeys had to avoid the French and Dutch territories where slavery remained in place for many decades. In fact, the French slaves did everything possible to escape to Antigua. That was the nearest one to the nearest colony for them at that time, to get out of French waters and get to neighboring British islands. That, in fact, brought about the end of slavery more quickly in the French islands. They break down because people were leaving and swimming, if they could, to an English territory. Despite the attempts to keep people away from the sea, fishing and the gathering of shellfish was an important additional source of food for our ancestors, and they sought at all costs to obtain fishing and sailing skills, if possible, as part of their livelihood strategies. Now, what you're looking at on that slide is one of the very few, I think it's the only, complete map of plantations and slave-dwelling areas in the Caribbean, and it is St. Kitts. It's done by a man called William McMahon in 1828. Many of you might be familiar with it. And if not, if you go on the websites of, there's a digital archive, archaeology archive on slavery, and the Liverpool museums, there are various museums in Britain and in the United States. You just have to look for digital archaeology, DAAC, something like that, and you find quite a lot of very interesting maps and images. So, but I put that on, and this is Jessop's estate, and a map of, there are about 2 slave villages on Jessop's estate in Nevis. Now, the shortage of land meant that slaves in the Leewards had more limited access to provision grounds on which to grow food for themselves and to generate some income for the Sunday markets. Slave-dwelling areas on the plantations were always within clear sight of the plantation owners. But on marginal land, it was steep, it would be near to ravines and guts, and the slaves were allocated limited farming plots there. Slave provision grounds, foraging, and the rearing of livestock were essential for their tenuous food security. They also depended on planters' rations, which in the mid-1700s were increasingly imported from North America. And this became a threat after the American Revolution in the 1770s because this trade ended. And it resulted in food scarcity, and 400 slaves died from malnutrition in St. Kitts in the next couple of years. It is documented that our ancestors supplemented their food supply by experimenting with wild fruits and vegetables, insects, and maximizing the use of their provision grounds. Slave settlements always had many trees interspersed with the dwellings. They planted fruit trees for food, for shade, and for material for building shelters and utensils. Calabash trees provided the latter. Banana plants and coconut trees provided not only food but material for thatched roofs and walls for the huts. And I've listed a lot of fruit trees here. You don't need to hear them because you know them. You have them in your gardens. And you have them because your ancestors taught us all to plant that as sources of food supply. And we must teach our children to eat those fruits. Pre- and post-emancipation people had limited access to building materials. They used mud, cane trash, banana trash, and palm branches for building houses. Their houses were light, replaceable, they required frequent maintenance, and particularly after emancipation, they built movable houses, as they didn't own the land on which the house was located, and we all know the term chattel housing. The organization of daily life, I have already begun that, but I want to talk a little bit, I want to just mention medicinal herbs. Garden plots always, and still do, feature herbs for medicinal use and household use. Official health care was almost non-existent, and the African community drew on their traditional herbal knowledge. Most communities had bush doctors and traditional midwives. In some places, they also gained additional knowledge from the remaining indigenous people. This happened in Jamaica. It would have happened in St. Vincent and probably in Dominica. Today, herbal medicine remains very important to us, and Caribbean herbalists and healers are still very well respected people in our communities. Archaeological sites show a lot of evidence of locally made clay pottery. Nowadays, we think that local pottery comes from Nevis, but local pottery was made in St. Kitts as well, and the archaeologists say that they can distinguish, it's a different type of clay. This was a women's activity based on knowledge from West Africa. They made bowls, water jugs, plant pots, coal pots, which is a stove that we still use today across the Caribbean for traditional recipes, particularly for slow-cooked food or herbal preparations. The pottery was not only for household needs, but it was sold. It generated income for the potters. Markets were crucial for slaves to sell agricultural and artisanal products and accumulate savings. Both men and women sought via the estate or elsewhere to develop skills that would generate higher earnings. Men tried to develop their carpentry and masonry skills, fishing, transport of goods, and work with estate machinery. What you will see is that in the post-emancipation period, all those skills that they acquired on the plantations and in the sugar factories became the basis of their engagement in wider economies after the end of slavery. For women, sewing, catering, caring for children or the sick, and pottery were similar outlets. Although they had no access to banks, they saved money, either to buy their freedom or for if it was possible, or for eventual purchase of land and other assets. They had 14-hour work days, 6 days a week. We really shouldn't complain these days, you know. Nonetheless, the slaves had some community time via the Sunday markets, via farming in their provision grounds, and during religious or social ceremonies. Their relationship with non-establishment churches and with missionary societies became increasingly important in the late 18th and 19th centuries for worship and to have access to basic education. A lot of the literacy training came via the churches. There were obstacles. The missionaries were expressly forbidden to teach the slaves to read in several territories. And there was little time even for children to have an education. But the slaves maximized the opportunities provided, first by Sunday school, and later by schooling during the week for their children. And in many cases, children were then expected to teach the adults what they had learned. Gradually, the church-based schools became the main avenues for obtaining primary education and eventually secondary education also. The Moravians, Methodists, Salvation Army, Baptists, and other religious denominations emerged as strategic allies also in the post-emancipation phase as they assisted the former slaves in getting access to land and establishing free villages where they could live independently and with human dignity. Right, should have changed to this earlier. Sorry about that. So these are all examples of the ingenuity and creative activities developed by our ancestors in their most vulnerable phase. They showed prowess also in physical conflict situations. Despite their limited access to lethal weapons, they were adept at strategically using the natural terrain, the weather, their forestry scouting skills, fear and surprise tactics successfully on many occasions against colonial militaries and the planters. The success of Maroon fighters in Jamaica and in Suriname bears witness to this. In our case, there is documentary evidence of slaves fighting bravely and persistently in defense of St. Kitts and Nevis, British communities against French attacks during the Franco-British Wars of the late 1700s. They disliked the French even more than they disliked the English. And they were determined not to be taken captive and transported to the French colonies for further enslavement in an unknown environment. These military talents of our people would resurface in later eras. Caribbean people have served with distinction in the British, US, and Canadian armed forces and in the security forces of their own countries. That goes, we can say the same for our French and Spanish-speaking Caribbean people with regards to their own security forces. Now, unfortunately, there's a very frustrating anonymity about most of our earliest ancestors. They're described at best by a first name, maybe an occupation. But just as we know the names of heroic freedom fighters, like Toussaint and Dessalines in Haiti, Boussa in Barbados, Nani and Kodjo of the Maroons, Taki, Sam Sharp, Paul Bogle in Jamaica, and Solitude in Guadeloupe, we also have the names of a few who managed to work within the system, move between the Caribbean and Europe, and in some cases also campaign for abolition. And I'm referring in this case to two people, Pero Jones and Fanny Coker, both from Mount Travers Estate in Nevis, who were owned by John Pinney between 1765 and the end of the century. You might want to ask questions, or you can go and look up their histories for yourselves. And I want to refer to someone who didn't come from here, Olaudah Equiano. He was kidnapped in Nigeria when he was 11. He was enslaved in Montserrat and Barbados. He became a free man. He purchased his freedom. He became a sailor and a merchant and living in Britain, and he campaigned for the abolition of the slave trade. He died in 1797, shortly before it became a reality. So that was just a little personal touch about early ancestors. Now I move to section 2, and our ancestors' lives after emancipation. The struggle, as Richardson puts it, Richardson, can't remember his first name, but in 1983, Bonham, thank you, he wrote a book on St. Kitts and Nevis and our migration history post-slavery. The struggle to expand the livelihood space is how he refers to the history of migration. Nowadays, we commemorate emancipation as a joyous occasion, wonderful landmark. But at that time, it was clouded by uncertainty, existential insecurity, and unrealized expectations. It was followed by decades of harsh poverty as the sugar economy in the Leewards declined and long-term economic depression set in. Emancipation in 1834 in St. Kitts, Nevis, and Montserrat was followed by 4 years of indentureship. In fact, there were riots in St. Kitts when they realized that there was going to be indentureship, and in Antigua there would be none. The Leewards have been described by historians and anthropologists as small islands with large questions because they are seen as a micro-laboratory in which you can observe the process of evolution from slavery into free peasant-based societies. Karen Fogg Alwig, and other authors, they point out that slavery gave way to another form of subjugation in which the obligations of the planters were lifted, while former slaves now had to take even more responsibility for themselves than before. They had to pay rent, they had to buy food, they had to obtain other necessities with starvation wages, and little or no access to land on which to grow food like they did before. They were legally free, but legally bound, as is expressed in a book on Antigua by Nicholson. I think I want to go back to that for now. There were a number of riots in various islands. At St. Kitts, there were at least 2. People were fighting for basic social and economic rights. And most planters were intent on keeping the labor force dependent, make them continue to live and work on the estates in exchange for shelter and miserable wages which would no longer include food. In St. Kitts and Nevis, there were very limited opportunities to buy or rent land and move away from the estates. Now, in St. Kitts, one free village was founded, Challengers. John Challenger provided 5 acres of land in 1841 for this village. By contrast, in Antigua, with more land, in 1858, there were 58 independent villages, often established with the help of the churches. In Jamaica, a much larger territory, by 1845, 19,000 ex-slaves had purchased land, and there were more than 200 free villages. In Nevis, there was no crown land to occupy, little land to purchase, even if they had savings. What evolved was sharecropping. Many had to stay on estate lands because they needed the housing. They cultivated the lands, and they received part of the crop instead of wages for their labor. In spite of the difficulties, this is interesting, in Nevis by 1848, 39 people had managed to purchase 150 acres in small lots, usually less than 2 acres, despite all these challenges. And by 1876, over 2,000 former slaves had become freeholders on small lots. Now, they were aided in this by a collapsing sugar economy, and more land became available because of this. They also had to save a lot of money to do this and pool resources. So this access to land, even small plots, was essential for our ancestors to build kinship networks that supported independent communities and to provide sanctuary and a more visible identity for their families at that time and for the future. There were various types of land tenure in the Caribbean, but most involved the concept of family land, where all the offspring had access to the land, they could build a house somewhere on it, and they had access to the fruit trees on the land. In fact, this came all the way down from the practices in the maroon societies back in the 1700s, right up to the 20th century modern Caribbean societies. And this is flagged by Jean Besson, amongst other historians and anthropologists, as a social institution of family land that was a dynamic Caribbean cultural creation. Now, major transitions in the Leeward Islands would be driven by a convergence of forces, and the newly freed population would take advantage of these circumstances to improve their lives. The new key to improving lives would be migration. Margaret Byron, in 1994, my sister, describes this as both an economic strategy and a resistance strategy. Now, in the British colonies, redistribution of labor had started even before emancipation, when slaves were transferred to Trinidad. How many people in Trinidad have you met whose name is Claxton and Pemberton? And have you met those people? Well, I have lived for 6 years in Trinidad, and I have met so many people with Nivision names and St. Kitts names. Now, some may have gone before the end of slavery, and most went after. Did you know that Eric Williams' great-grandmother was from Nevis? Eric Williams' great-grandmother went to Trinidad in the 1850s with her employer and settled there. So he has Nevis roots. If you go and read up on his autobiography, you will find it somewhere. He, like many other people, have links with the Leeward Islands with Nevis and with St. Kitts and Nevis. Now, there were more profitable sugar economies opening up in Trinidad and the Guyana-Suriname area. There was an acute need for labor. Higher wages were offered. Boats, very, very kind of insecure boats. We know about the accident, tragic accident yesterday or day before between Antigua and St. Kitts. Well, our people, who had all these historical memories of slave ships, they jumped on boats and they headed down to the southern Caribbean. Between 1838 and 1848, 11,000 people arrived in Trinidad from the Leeward Islands. And between 1850 and 1921, 50,000 Barbadians moved to Trinidad and to Guyana. This migratory wave subsided once wages decreased. When it started, you were getting twice what you earned in St. Kitts and Nevis in Trinidad. But after indentured labor started arriving from India in Trinidad, the wages decreased. However, a percentage of workers remained in Trinidad. They brought their families if they could get access to land and settle. Many of us have relatives in Trinidad. My family included. There are more Byrons there than there are here. This was only the first of several migrations around the Caribbean area by our ancestors over the next 100 years. Most, at this time, these were not permanent migrations. They would leave and return home periodically in response to labor needs, economic growth and decline in various parts of the circum-Caribbean area. So, after 1880, the destinations became Costa Rica and Panama for the building of railways and then the Panama Canal. And in Costa Rica, many Jamaicans stayed on to work on banana plantations. It is estimated that over 55,000 West Indian migrants from both the French and the British Caribbean went to Panama in the 1880s to participate in the first attempt to construct a canal. That was being done by a French firm, so they recruited from Martinique and Guadeloupe. A further 200,000 went back to Panama in the 1900 to 1930s to work on the successful Panama Canal. For Eastern Caribbean migrant laborers, the main destinations in the late 19th and early 20th century became the Dominican Republic and Cuba to work in expanding sugar plantation economies that were fueled by American investment. Over 140,000 British Islanders went to Cuba, not many from St. Kitts and Nevis, but there were a few. Many from St. Kitts and Nevis traveled to Bermuda in 1906 to construct a wharf, and you will see on your slide 3,000 migrant workers went from the Leeward Islands. And by 1904, there were 1,600 from the Leeward Islands. The Dominican Republic was the most significant destination for our migrant workers. As you know, from St. Kitts, Nevis, and Antigua, and a few other parts of the northeastern Caribbean, about 9,000 to 10,000 people went to the Dominican Republic. While a majority of Jamaicans, Barbadians, and Dominicans traveled to Cuba and to Venezuela to work in sugar or on the building of infrastructure for new oil fields. The 300,000 people went to Venezuela. When I was a student in Venezuela in 1977, I met Venezuelans of Dominican descent at the university where I was. In the 1930s, many people from St. Kitts and Nevis traveled to Aruba and Curacao to work in the oil refinery operations. And later, during the Second World War, when the US military was building bases in Trinidad and Antigua and so. These territories became new venues for migrant workers from St. Kitts and Nevis. So all these migratory movements were driven not only by the lack of opportunities at home, also by global and regional political and economic trends and our ancestors' responses based on their courage, their entrepreneurial spirit, and maybe a sense of adventure. In some cases, their recruitment was influenced by the fact that the investors were American and they wanted people who spoke English. Their recruitment was also based on the skills they had acquired working in the sugar factories or in construction, building Brimstone Hill, or with machinery or on the land. Our female ancestors also migrated. They generally provided support services, indispensable support services, catering, laundering, running boarding houses, caring for the sick. A prime example was Mary Seacole from Jamaica and her boarding houses in Panama and then in the Crimea during wars, or in Panama it was the other reasons. Now, these people boarded dubious marine vessels. They went to places with foreign languages and foreign jurisdictions. How many of you do that now? You don't go here because they don't speak English. They, whose ancestors might never have moved from an estate before 1938, now traveled 1,000 miles across the Caribbean Sea to live and work in the greater Caribbean area. And in the process, they helped to construct some of the most major infrastructural projects in the hemisphere in energy, air, sea, and road transport, and security. And they also worked on some of the largest agricultural production areas in the region. They made a noticeable cultural impact in the societies to which they migrated. If you go to the eastern side of the Dominican Republic, you're going to see Giant Despair. You're going to see Sagua. You're going to see all kinds of folklore, music, dance, sports, and religion from the people who they call the Cocolos, the populations from the Leeward Islands and from Tortola. I think Cocolo comes from Tortola. Olive Sr. writes that the West Indian pioneers introduced to Central America their ways of social organization, burial and mutual aid schemes, sports and games, literary and debating societies, churches, schools, and social organizations. They did the same thing in Cuba. She points out that many of these migrants became catalysts of political and social change if they returned home, based on their exposure, experiences, and resources generated abroad. They generated growth back at home by remitting to their families money for land purchases, home improvements, education, and the establishment of small businesses. They came back with new ideas and outlooks to their islands. They had acquired new technical and organizational skills, and some became involved in civil rights campaigns, labor movements, and eventual political organizations back at home. We have the examples of Mary Shaw and Gary in Grenada. Well, Gary wasn't that involved in human rights organization, but certainly labor movement. Bustamante and Marcus Garvey in Jamaica. Another outcome of these and later migratory movements to the UK, US, and Canada was the shifts in the demographic distribution of the working age population. A gender imbalance developed with more women of working age in St. Kitts and Nevis as compared to men. There were major changes to the lives of women and girls, whether they remained at home or left as migrants. The last major migratory phase began in the second half of the 20th century to the UK, the US, and Canada. Although people had been going to the US and those places in small numbers since end of the 19th century. first to the US, to the UK, and for St. Kitts and Nevis, Margaret Byron calculates that there were over 8,000 during a 6-year period from 1954 who traveled to Britain. And there were also exoduses to either the US and Canada from the 1960s onwards. Now, these migrations tended to be longer term, probably permanent, although the migrants retained close links with their countries of origin. I don't want to go into the push factors. You know all about this story anyway. But we should emphasize the creative ways in which people leveraged resources to finance migration. You don't just take up yourself and put a plastic bag over your back and head to the US or Britain. You need money. They drew on their kinship resources to help them with the financing and to care for children and elderly relatives back home. Migration strategies were usually familial. They entailed the pooling of resources, and they were underpinned by trust and reciprocity. For these migrants, and for our present-day societies, individuals' strivings and motivation are as much linked, going back to Maslow's needs, to needs groups 3, 4, and 5 as they are to the fundamental struggle for basic material needs. Also, in small societies like our own, as among our migrants abroad, societal networks, a sense of belonging, and the desire for visibility and for recognition are major motivating factors underpinning individuals' activities and achievements. It's important to note that in addition to the importance of migration for resourcing the development of St. Kitts and Nevis, the critical architects of our present societies are the folks who remained or the folks who returned, who have gradually overhauled our laws and justice system, who have formed the labor unions and the professional bodies, the political organizations and state institutions, the religious and humanitarian organizations, those who have serviced our schools, clinics, hospitals, libraries, other social development institutions, and have built small, medium, and large businesses in our societies. These are the people who have engaged on a daily basis to resolve the contradictions described by Elsa Govaya, the first ever professor of West Indian history at UWI. In 1965, she wrote, "The emancipation of the slaves in the Leewards was the beginning of a social revolution that is still working itself out, built upon basic principles of racial inequality and subordination. Many of the values of the old slave society inevitably carried over into the era of freedom. We are attempting to build a new heritage of freedom upon structures that are linked to the heritage of slavery. We have an uneasy union between democracy and the accumulated remains of enslavement. These ancestors have striven to transform our society from one of being former British subjects. We became British subjects after we stopped being British slaves. And now we are contemporary citizens of St. Kitts and Nevis, Caribbean small state. So I am wrapping up, don't get too anxious. So to summarize the discussion, the ancestors prioritized the building of community and solidarity practices. They placed a high value on increasing their autonomy wherever possible. They recognized the importance of access to land for so many reasons, food security and income. They recognize and they prioritize both formal and informal education. While they held on to traditional belief systems and folk wisdom, they also embraced new faiths, Christianity in particular, but they infused it with their own experiences and identities. They transformed Christianity in the Caribbean with their experiences and interpretations and their cultural approaches to worship. Over time, they sharpened their strategic understanding of their physical and institutional environments and of the local and international processes that might affect their lives. Our ancestors were great diplomats and negotiators. They formed strategic alliances with non-establishment churches, for example. They negotiated treaties with colonial administrations. In Jamaica, the Maroons, and there was a treaty. There was a treaty in Suriname, and there was a treaty in St. Vincent, which I think the British broke. They formed workers' rights movements to fight for better and fairer working conditions. They could recognize and seize local and international opportunities when they became available. They demonstrated very strong organizational skills in their associations and organizations and unions and political bodies. And something that I haven't mentioned previously, they developed very strong communication skills via a range of media. Music, drums. Drums are not only music, they are messaging instruments. Wind instruments like the abeng, which is a cattle horn that the Maroons use in Jamaica. Conch shell horns. If you go to Carnival in Guadeloupe, they blow conchs. We use it to sell fish, or we used to. Songs, calypsos, redemption songs, and so on, and the human voice. Oratory, the written word, and other art forms. Quilts. You know how many maps, escape maps, are woven into quilts? Carving, braiding. People used to braid escape routes into cornrows in children's hair. Painting, sculpture. These were all forms of communication as well as art forms. They responded to difficult situations like food insecurity by the strategies that I mentioned, livestock rearing, foraging, and various ways of husbanding, various ways of agricultural production. Although they were victims of forced migration with severely restricted freedom of movement, they embraced mobility, and it became, in time, a defining theme of their existence. In some territories, marronage was a strategy to control their own lives during slavery. But for most Caribbean ancestors, mobility only became possible in the post-emancipation period with migration. Franklin Knight quotes Fernand Braudel on this. Changing the impossible and the unattainable to the possible often involves spatial movement and migration. So mobility and migration have been central themes of Caribbean life since the 1840s, just as they were when we arrived from Africa. They used social engineering and adaptation to respond to their circumstances. And I want to focus here on gender. Caribbean matrifocal family structures. One cannot overemphasize the evolution of women's roles. We are the backbone of Caribbean families and societies. That is in part a consequence of our ancestors' experiences and the evolution and the adaptation that had to take place. Girls and women have been central in protecting and preserving Caribbean families, and they have been at the center of developing and leveraging kinship networks. Caribbean women's nurturing and governance roles have been vital for contemporary national and regional development. Our ancestors never lost the ability to enjoy themselves, to laugh, to play, and to relax. And their capacity for comedy, satire, and irony has been very well developed by their life experiences. Their ingenuity turned loss and scarcity via adaptation into new discoveries and inventions. So, the Caribbean ancestors who inspire us with their achievements are far too numerous to list in one short lecture, but I encourage all of us to continue to study their lives and to be inspired by them. They are beacons to motivate us, and they offer important lessons about surviving adversity, drawing on knowledge from the past, and making new discoveries that enable us to chart new possibilities. So, our ancestors have bequeathed to us. I'm saying this because sometimes we are very narrow in our conceptualizing who we are and who belongs and who doesn't belong. All of you have relatives all around this Caribbean. Our ancestors have bequeathed to us a pan-Caribbean and global legacy of far-flung roots and branches shaped by more than 400 years of migrations. We are not just two islands. We are linked to many places by migration and family. And we must be conscious of all these connections and not be too narrow in thinking, in conceiving of our identities. Our ancestors' lives emphasize the importance of building and maintaining community and working always to strengthen freedom and autonomy. And our ancestral history demonstrates that family and community solidarity, kinship networks, faith, and strong core values are the most important assets with which to chart one's identity. And the final slide, is it here? There is a wonderful sculpture that was done as a Windrush monument in London, in Hackney. It's done by a sculptor from Montserrat. She is the first female black artist to have a permanent public sculpture erected in Britain. And I like it very much. I think that every Caribbean person can identify with that. Thank you for your patience and your attention. So, I have got some here. Mr. Ayers.
Dr. Byron Reed, thank you very much. I must say, this is the first time I have listened to a discourse on slavery where at the end I don't feel sad or angry. You know, when you hear about slavery, it's usually a focus on the struggles and the torture, but this one is really about the triumph, and as you mentioned, triumph of the human spirit. You summarized quite nicely the main points of your presentation, but I just wanted to highlight this issue of the triumph of the human spirit, because that is what we really need now. Despite what they were going through, the challenges, the struggles, the inhumane treatment, our ancestors found ways of creating societies for themselves, rebuilding, working together, and advancing themselves. Now we are not faced with those types of challenges, but somehow I find that as a people, we are still not moving as fast as we should. You also mentioned the creative activities, and they sound familiar because you talk about food security, which is topical right now. You talked about the medicinal herbs and the bush doctors. We know them, and now there's a great conversation on medicinal marijuana. You talked about, how they handled conflict and security. We need to do better there as to how we are handling conflict and security issues now. And one that stuck to me as a central bank staff, where you talked about the finances, how they were able to bank and save without access to banks. So really it's a story of, as you said, triumph of the human spirit, a telling story, a comforting story, one that makes me feel happy. Despite the struggles, it shows that when we come together as a people, we really can do great things. So thank you for changing my mindset when it comes to slavery and for making me feel happy, not about what had happened, but about what came out of it. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we now are open for your questions. You can send your questions to the UWI campus and the UWI Open Campus St. Kitts Nevis site, their Facebook pages, and the UWI Open Campus and ECCB Connects YouTube channels. We do have a question from Facebook, one of our Facebook viewers. What happened to the land owned by ex-slaves, since we as their descendants don't generally own land, legacy land?
Okay, I can't give a complete answer because I'm neither a historian nor a lawyer. I can tell you of a couple of things that I have read. The Maroons in Jamaica, Maroon territory, there is a principle among the Maroons, as far as I'm aware, that land is passed matrilineally. You inherit family land via the mother, via the female, which is a bit different from Western legal principles. And there is, I believe there is communal land in amongst the Maroons. Now, I also came across some research on, I think it is St. Croix. I think it is St. Croix. And it was, the whole article was about family land in St. Croix. And I don't know if this is still the case, but up until a certain point in time, there was this concept of family land. There is a type of title, there either is or there was. And this was actually in a text, an agricultural text, not primarily a historical text, but it was looking at land tenure. And members of the land, I think, was first owned by one matriarch, and then she left it to all her descendants. And up to the time when that research was done, which I think was in the late 80s, you had to consult with the rest of the family. They had about 10 acres. But once there was agreement, you could build your house on a particular part of the land, and you could cultivate a garden plot on that land. And that is precisely what Jean Besson was speaking about. Apparently, this was a practice in a number of, it was a practice in parts of Jamaica and other possible areas of the Caribbean. But beyond that, I'm afraid I can't give a proper answer because it's not my specialty.
Thank you. Continuing in a similar vein, you know, the hot topic now is reparation. It has been around for some time, but countries are now pushing more this reparation issue. What are your feelings or thoughts about it?
Okay, I think I have two main opinions on reparation. If reparations, I mean, the more you read about the atrocities of slavery, the more one can come to the conclusion that yes, there should be reparations because terrible human rights violations took place. But what form would reparations take? And I think that if there are to be reparations of any kind, they should be related to areas of human development. I liked what I heard the other day from that family, this British family in Grenada, the Trevelyan's, and their decision to provide scholarships for students at UWI, I think at the Open Campus and maybe other campuses. Human development, maybe medical research, maybe, areas that are investments for the future and for improving the human development chances of people whose ancestors suffered so badly. That's one thing. And then the other thought I have comes from a book written by Earl Lovelace called Salt. I don't know if anybody has read Salt. It's one of his last novels. It's a fantastic book. What Earl Lovelace seems to be doing fictionally, through fiction, he's saying that the process of reparations should not be related to resolving the huge problematic relationship between the former slavers and the enslaved. He says that coming out of that, lots of violence and lots of terrible things have happened within Caribbean societies between all our we are fragmented societies with different groups, and fictionally, he is writing this story, but he is saying that reparations is a process for all of our societies to engage in among the different parts of our own societies. It's not simply that somebody out there must come and give us reparations. We have to explain to our fellow citizens today why we did what we did and try to compensate for that. And he thinks that our societies would be healthier if that sort of process went on. Unfortunately, that is the hardest type of reparations process, That's what I think about reparations.
Okay, thank you. Now, a lot of times social ills are blamed on slavery as a legacy of slavery, breakdown in family, what's happening with our children, what's happening with our identity. We're saying it's from slavery. But you have just outlined lots of positive outcome from slavery. Why do you think we are not hooking on to the positive that came out of slavery more than we are doing?
In politics, in political science, there is this constant debate about structure and agency. and which is the more powerful force in determining the course of history. Structures, and the structures of the past and the structures that have been shaped by those events of the past, they certainly have a powerful impact. But there's also human agency and there's human will. You can't say that one is stronger than the other, but it is important to remind ourselves that we are agents of we can help to shape what happens. We might not be able to completely overcome some of the damage that has been done, but we can certainly lessen the impact through human agency.
So it's up to us, really.
We have to think that it's up to us. I mean, when you look at what some of these people in the past have done to climb out of the very deep holes that they found themselves in, we really shouldn't be complaining as much as we do, you know. Not that everything is perfect. It's far from perfect, but it could be far worse.
You ended on a strong point, a call for us to stop narrowing our perception of our identity. You spoke about we are related to people throughout the region, yet our countries are plagued by this issue of insularity. Okay, even in St. Kitts, you have the St. Kitts Nevis division within a small space. Why do you think this still exists?
I suppose to some extent it's natural, it's human nature. People set up divisions when there are conflicting interests, and sometimes these divisions are used for political purposes and other purposes. But I think one of the things we could do is start teaching history in earnest. Every day I hear people say, the Spanish are the...
Yes.
Many of those Spanish are people who are descended from our people. Their grandfathers and their great-grandfathers went from St. Kitts and they went from Nevis, and they ended up in the Dominican Republic. Me personally, I have cousins in Bermuda. I have cousins in the Dominican Republic. I have cousins in Trinidad. And elsewhere, but those are three. Oh yeah, and I think that we have cousins in Cuba. Those are as a result of those migrations that happened. So, we can't say that, those people have nothing to do with us. In fact, we should go and look for them and find out who it is we're related to. It is from living for 6 years in Trinidad that I realized just how extensive our family is there, when I went to the Dominican Republic, I went to San Pedro de Macorís and to La Romana because I wanted to see if I could find people who could tell me a bit about one or two family members that went there. Haven't succeeded yet, but...
Okay. Dr. Byron Reed, thank you very much. I did say in the introductions that it would have been informative, enlightening, and thought-provoking, and you did deliver.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you. Okay, let me...
and Resilience Dialogue 2023 welcomes you to 2 days of enlightening healthcare discussion and innovative tech ideas and exhibitions.
Register for free via ECCB's website to join companies, specialists, thought leaders, disruptors, and transformers that are passionate about issues that are key to your health and welfare needs.
I now call on Tessa Isaac, Operations Manager at the Brimstone Hill Fortress National Park, to offer the vote of thanks.
To our virtual and in-studio audience, I say good evening. My task is simple but important, saying thank you. First, I wish to thank the members of the History and Heritage Committee for their involvement in this event. Thanks to those who made suggestions, gave feedback, and advice, culminating in the successful staging of this event. Thank you all. We look forward to your continued support. Secondly, this annual event is made possible every year by the UE Open Campus. So to the UE Open Campus, led by Mrs. Gail Gray Phillip and her team, we say many, many thanks. I wish to thank the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank through Ms. Shermalyn Kirby and her technical team for staging this event, which requires a lot of planning, technical input, and expertise. On behalf of the History and Heritage Committee, I wish to express our sincere and profound gratitude to them for allowing us to use their facilities. Thank you, Shermalyn, also for chairing this event. An important entity for the annual History and Heritage Month of activities, who usually lead the charge in putting this event together with the help of all the other stakeholders who make up the History and Heritage Committee, is the Brimstone Hill Fortress National Park Society. Sir Probyn Innis, president from 2005 to 2017, initiated the idea. And we wish to thank his daughters, Angela and Marcia Innis, for representing the family in person. Also to Mrs. Innis, who is with us virtually. To represent the Brimstone Hill Fortress National Park Society tonight, we have the General Manager, Mr. Percival Hanley. Thank you, Mr. Hanley, for presenting remarks on behalf of this society. To introduce our featured speaker is student representative, Open Campus St. Kitts Nevis, Tyrese Charles. Many thanks, Ms. Charles, for introducing our featured speaker. Mr. Sanjay Keynes, Chapter Chair, Student Guild, St. Kitts Nevis. Thank you for sharing your lovely poem. This, of course, now leads us to our featured speaker, Professor Jessica Byron Reid. Professor Byron Reid, what a pleasure it was to have you to present to us this evening. Thank you for agreeing to do this lecture. It was indeed well received. So again, we extend to you our sincere thanks and gratitude. Finally, a lecture like this would be pointless without an audience. We therefore thank all of you physically present and those who joined us via the various social media channels. We look forward to next year's lecture and invite you all to join us once again. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We'll now present. Make a small presentation to Professor.
just want to thank you for such a wonderful presentation. Present you with this.
Thank you very
You're
much.
welcome.
Very nice.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of the 2023 Probyn Innis Memorial Lecture. The topic, celebrating 400 years of ancestral creativity and ingenuity. The distinguished presenter was Professor Jessica Byron Reed, former Director, Institute of International Relations, St. Augustine Campus, Trinidad and Tobago, and former lecturer, Department of Government, Mona Campus, Jamaica. We thank you all for joining us. Do have a pleasant night.